Hey, thanks everybody for coming back. Hope the coffee was good. We're obsessed in this industry with acronyms and technical phrases, but it goes back a long way to the 1933 Securities Act, which introduced us to the joys of 144A and Regulation S and all of these good things. To discuss the different formats, we've got two very contrasting issuers here to talk about it, who have taken two different routes to the US dollar market, and I'd like to ask both of them to talk about that today. Wojciech from CIBC and Raphael from Munich München Hypothekenbank.
Yes, correct.
Or Munich Mortgage Bank, probably easier. Yeah. Now, Wojciech, can I start with you? So you have issued in 144A format. You've chosen to do that, unlike some of your peers. And I think you've been doing that for 8 years now in that format. Can you tell us a little bit about why you've taken that approach and what your program?
Yes, so actually I almost feel like in a KGB interrogation room with those
lights are very bright.
Lights glaring, but I will say the truth, only the truth.
And you think these wires are the microphones?
Right. Yes, you're absolutely correct, Richard. We've been issuing in 144A form, obviously covered bonds since January 2010. Now, in the meantime, in 2013, we switched to another program from structured to legislative. Going back to 2010, effectively, there were two choices. There was Reg S and there was 144A. There was a third choice that appeared briefly in 2012, 2013, but I'm not sure we want to go there. So from our perspective, 144A was probably the more obvious rule. Now, I used to have a pain execution scale, which I haven't referenced for probably a couple of years or so, if not longer. But when speaking about 144A, so let's say the pain execution scale is from 1 being the easiest, 10 being the most complicated or perhaps aggravating. Having issued over the years in 5 currencies, I would probably say Swiss franc is 1, Australian dollar is 2, sterling euro would be 5, 144A US dollar would be 12 out of 10. But obviously, apart from the aggravation of the and complication and cost of the execution, there are certain advantages. Obviously, the most obvious one is you are able to access the QIB, so effectively qualified investment buyers that can buy 144A paper in the US versus if you are issuing Reg S only, you are effectively targeting dollar buyers outside of the US. So from the standpoint of our funding needs being probably a bit bigger than my friend Raphael's here, or correct me if I'm wrong, but we decided to go 144A. I mean, there are certain conditions precedent to issuance of 144A, and probably the most important one is my friend Jerry Marlatt in the room. Yes, so I have to be careful how nasty I'm about US or New York-based lawyers, but you're going to get an honorable mention. So ultimately, it comes down to US counsel or two sets of counsels, the underwriter and the issuer. producing a so-called 10b5 opinion, which I think in very brief terms states for the benefit of the underwriting syndicate and probably ultimately the investors that there was sufficient due diligence done in order for the issue to proceed. Well, what's the sufficient due diligence? In no particular order, and Jerry, jump in if there is something else that escapes my mind. In terms of financial disclosure information, it helps when the issuer's financial disclosure is comparable to US standards. For somebody like CIBC or any other Canadian bank, where I think most of them, with the exception of one, I could be wrong on this one, are NYSE reporting issuers, that condition precedent is effectively solved. Notwithstanding, there is always the need or apparent need for Jerry's friends to crawl through board minutes for all the relevant committees. So this is a matter of producing copies of most recent board minutes, or at least recent since your last issuance, locking up a bunch of lawyers in the room in our offices in New York, and then having access to those minutes, which is obviously part of the due diligence. So that's the due diligence as associated with the issuer. Then there is due diligence associated with the collateral, which I think, from what I understand more recently, notwithstanding that the securitization SEC Rule AB does not technically apply to 144A issuance, I'm led to believe that from the standpoint of how the lawyers look at collateral, it to a degree reflects the requirements of Rule AB, notwithstanding that we are not required to do this type of disclosure, and if we were to, there would be no 144A issuance out of Canadian banks, because there is about 270 fields that are required for proper Reg AB disclosure, most of which are inapplicable to Canada. And some of it, while applicable, they are not data elements that are really important or relevant in the context of the Canadian market. On top of it, you need to make a representation that everything is accurate, and I'm not sure I want to make the representation that everything's accurate for 270 data fields for 100,000 loans that we have in our cover pool. So after we will have gone through this. Now, let's not forget accounting comfort letters, and you have to do two types of it, because you need the US-style SFAS letter, and because our program is actually registered in London, you need a European-style comfort letter. Did I forget something else? Yeah, okay.
That's quite a long list already.
So after all this is done, and it's actually helpful that you have every couple of days all lawyers on deck call, confirmation, is there anything else outstanding? Hopefully the answer is nothing else is outstanding, and hopefully the night before you do go, no go call, somebody didn't realize, oh, by the way, we'll need that extra piece of information that's going to take another 2 or 3 days to obtain. Hence the 12 on the pain of the execution scale. Having said all this, ultimately we have been traditionally able, again, since 2010, I think we would have done probably 8 or 9 benchmark-sized transactions. The size of those, excluding TAPS, would have been between $1.25 to $2 billion, and in all of the cases, they were cost effective in the context how we look of covered bond issuance. So I guess no pain, no gain.
Well, actually, let's explore that gain. So which investors have you accessed that you wouldn't be able to access if you hadn't gone through that? And is it worth?
Well, actually, the profile of the investors have somewhat changed, because when we were issuing the structured program with slightly different collateral, these were effectively zero credit risk default insured mortgages. The books were majority US. I would say on average 80–90% of the book composition were US investors that otherwise most likely would not be able to buy in Reg S. Once we moved to the legislative program, that composition in terms of how much of the US-based buyers were in various transactions would have decreased to probably 50–60%. The rest of it was actually a combination of Europe, Asia, and to a degree even Canada.
Rafael, you've obviously got less of a pain threshold. You don't want to go through this 12 and all of these quite painful things that Wojciech is describing here. From what you're hearing, I guess you're not being persuaded to do that. But tell me about the Reg S program and why you could feel that you can satisfy your funding needs with that, without this pain.
I like the expression, no pain, no gain. And I'm very happy that none of my board member colleagues is within the room, because when I was younger, a few years ago, we also checked whether 144A is interesting for us or not. And you can imagine that I was very positive on that. I'm representing an issuer from Bavaria, Munich, city in Germany, a pretty nice area, similar to Vancouver, but no sea, unfortunately. Very expensive, as I learned, Vancouver is very expensive as well. And we are issuing in several currencies, quite often very expensive spreads. I see my friends from several central investment banks, they know spreads better than I know. And as we like to diversify our investor base, as everybody does, I had the dream that 144A fits excellent in my funding profile. And I love to travel. So, yeah, I have to mention that. So I checked that. It's a long-term process, as Wojciech mentioned. And unfortunately, the documentation costs were so high, so ridiculous high, that I thought, is it really worth or not? At this point, I still thought, yes, it is. We also thought, oh, we have to change few processes internally, because internal audits in Europe are slightly, but different to what we see in the US. The main reason why we stopped, and unfortunately I have to admit it was not me, it was my board member colleagues which stopped me to identify 144A, whether it's okay or not, was a situation when I was to the East Coast. I was talking to a potential investor, and he asked me a question. Rafael, what do you think? A Texas-based mid-sized bank as you are is coming to Munich, presenting itself, asking for a credit line. Would your credit officers give a credit line to this potential issuer? And my answer was, of course not. And he said, yes, that's the situation you are also faced to. CIBC is a common name on the Northern American continent, but Münchner Hüb, I don't ask my friends from Europe if they heard about my name, but a local will not know Münchner Hüb. And please keep in mind that QIBs are not so much familiar with covered bonds. In Germany, we call that product Pfandbriefe. So At both situations, not familiar with covered bonds, and on top, an unknown name, how much success will you have with an issue? And that was the situation where we thought, okay, is it worth to go for it or not? Unfortunately, it's not. That's the answer. Secondly, we have to admit that the biggest US dollar investor base, unfortunately for coverage, is not in Northern America. It's in Asia. And it's still in Asia. Whenever some issuer is interested in issuing coverage in US dollar format, and you can take a look into the stats of recent deals. Of course, in this year, we have seen just one from Northern Luxembourg, unfortunately. Not even one Canadian issuer issued in US dollar. But the trades we have seen last year, within the 10 trades, 47% of the allocation went to central banks. And these central banks are mainly, please correct me guys if I'm wrong, are mainly in Asia, maybe in Switzerland, and some of the offshore US investors. So the conclusion of all that is, for an issuer, even having a huge funding plan and most of the funding sourced by covered bonds in specific currencies, for us, it's not really worth to go the extra mile, going through the whole process, spending $1 million or more for the program. It's too heavy to handle this product.
I hear your comments about name recognition and product recognition, but isn't there also a point of how much you've got to do? Wojciech, you issue quite large deals quite frequently. Is there a point where you get to a certain size where, okay, that $1 million of costs can be amortized?
I doubt. To be honest with you, I doubt. If you want to be in the US dollar market, you have to issue at least $650 million in dollars. Some investors request $1 billion. Do you have this natural need in dollars? Few global issuer does. Most of them don't. So even within our funding needs and coverage represent 4 to 5 billion a year, which is a decent size issuing in, out of Germany in fund format. You don't need to go through these. That's my experience I did so far. Because of the Eastern Asian-based investor group.
Question for both of you. Given how little dollar issuance there has been this year, and given there are investors out there who want it, two questions really. Firstly, how much reverse inquiry do you get from dollar investors saying, please, please issue, or private placement or public format? And secondly, to what extent is that dependent on the level of the basis swap? Who wants to?
I'll go first. Yes, we do get occasional reverses. Our strong preference, though, is not to issue private placements out of the covered program, and the principal reason why we don't like private placements is most of the people in the room may have heard, and especially if you attended one of the early sessions on Wednesday, this minor thing called 4% issuance limits that our regulator has imposed upon the industry in 2007, and we've been trying to do something about it for now probably 9 years, and it was hands down the least unsuccessful industry initiative I've ever been involved in my banking career, but be it as it may. Where I'm going with this, our preference is, to the extent we have limited issuance capacity, is to issue in benchmark public form rather than smaller pieces in private placement form. Having said so, we always welcome a reverse inquiry that could form an anchor order for a potential benchmark size public issuance.
But only as a lead order, not as a...
Unlikely
Okay.
at this time.
Okay.
We don't have any issues with private placement versus a benchmark format. I have to admit, whenever you go to Asia for the last 2 years and you try to promote a euro-denominated covered bond, the door doesn't open. Why? Because these investors are looking for yield, high yield, in brackets, please. Yeah, so dollars opens the door. We see definitely reverse inquiries, and I'm very happy about that question, Richard, because 2 days ago we had such an issue. There are investors in the market looking for huge private placements and including the basis. We issued in Swiss franc denominated, but it was an investor who calculates in dollars. This is not a usual issue, but that shows the potential whenever the issuer, whenever the investor is able to use cross-currency swaps, he can benefit from this situation at the moment. And this is pretty good for issuer as well. But you have to need to have the flexibility, and on top, of course, the investor has to have the same. But it's possible. Should I mention that I issued with HSBC? Yes, I do.
Yes, you probably should.
That was the commercial break. I do have to pay me afterwards.
But to what extent, I mean, they did that because the basis swap was favorable and they could turn it into an attractive dollar yield. Do you actually follow the basis swap and think, okay, I issue in dollars at this level, I swap it back to euros at that level?
It depends on the currency. Whenever an issuer has a natural need in a specific currency, in our case, we need Swiss franc. We are pretty close to Switzerland. We have asset business in Switzerland. So it's very helpful at the end for an issuer like Münchner Hüb. In businesses where we are not involved on the asset side, we have to ask ourselves twice whether it makes sense to issue in that specific currency or not, because under German Pfandbrief law, you will be charged with additional collateral, which costs money whenever you have a currency mismatch. So you think twice whether it's worth to do such a one-hit wonder or not.
Okay. Wojciech, how do you think about the basis? What was that? You pay a fortune for the program to your lawyers, and then you suddenly find the basis what moves against you, or do you issue anyway?
Well, I guess we always look at probably more cross-currency rather than basis, but both. I mean, ultimately, the way we look at the covered program, that's our by far the most international funding program, and we look at it principally as currency, investor jurisdiction diversification. Having said so, the program is effectively funding a Canadian mortgage book. Now, funding is fungible. You can raise funds here and allocate it at somewhere else, but ultimately, the initial comparison as to what currency we would issue comes back to where that currency swaps to either US or Canadian dollars. Now, since we are talking here in terms of US dollars, the basis cross-currency Canada-US is relatively stable, and I stress relatively because there have been some recent developments that made it actually interesting to watch. But ultimately, when issuing in US dollars, it's more of a function of credit spread rather where the cross-currency is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to open it up for questions. Before I do, if you can think about that, one curveball question. There's obviously an enormous amount of US dollars held offshore at the moment, a lot of it by corporates, US corporates not able to repatriate their cash for tax reasons. But with the tax proposals currently in the US, a very real possibility that there'll be some kind of holiday on the tax rate and a repatriation. Does that fundamentally change the amount of offshore liquidity that, that fuels these offshore investors?
I wished, but I'm not optimistic on that issue. The reason is that for many years, as long as I'm in this industry, whenever we issue in euro or other currencies, corporates are significantly low in participation in covered bonds. Yeah. Why should US do that? I don't see that. Hopefully I'm wrong. Yeah, that may open the room for new ideas, but on a serious note, corporates are not the specific investor in covereds.
Okay. Do we have any questions? No? Okay. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank both of my panelists very much for your comments. And now I'm going to hand over to Per Sagbakken, who's going to give a case study of his experiences of issuing on behalf of DNB Nordbolig Credit. Thank you, and thank you very much to my panelists.